Hey y'all, here at OS Reviews. So in the past, we've checked out a few devices from XGoody, a brand that pretty much specializes on budget tech. The majority of their phones can be found for under $100. Many of them try to imitate more expensive products. However, to reach that low price, they had to cut corners somewhere, and oftentimes that includes many of their products only have 3G connectivity. And of course, with the 4G LTE migration here in the United States, that means a lot of these phones will simply no longer function, with T-Mobile and AT&T just cutting off support. XGoody's response to that is bringing out more devices now with 4G LTE support, which to be honest isn't anything revolutionary or exciting, but at least it means these phones at least will continue to function in terms of making calls. They're still rock bottom in terms of pricing and specs, so this particular model that we're taking a look at today is their newest XGoody V40, and it sells for under 85 bucks. Design-wise, this is a much more grounded appearance than many of the earlier phones. Gone is all the flashy gradient colored finishes. We have a matte surface. It doesn't really shine or catch your eye as much. I would definitely much prefer a more utilitarian design if it means that the experience is better. It still is using a quad-core processor from MediaTek, pretty entry-level, clocked at 1.33 gigahertz. It is at least optimized to run on Android Go Edition, so apps are a little lighter. We'll talk about the performance later on in this video. Comes in two colors and does charge using USB Type-C. And there's a 3000 milliamp hour capacity battery inside, which is non-replaceable on this particular model. Now, areas where the specs are still, again, definitely super entry level would include RAM, where this model only has 2 gigabytes. That is extremely low, but keeping in mind that a lot of Android Go Edition phones require just 1 gig, at least it still functions, but it's another area where I really think even budget phones should get you at least 3 gigs, if not 4, increasingly, since more and more apps, as well as Android, is getting just more resource intensive. So aside from the phone itself, you also get another film screen protector. One is already factory pre-applied. There's also a third tempered glass screen protector, so it's a very nice accessory that they give you to protect the screen, along with a free TPU soft carrying case, along with a quick user guide, SIM ejector tool, USB Type-C charging and data cable, along with a wall adapter. So it is a little bit funny that, again, these ultra budget phones seem to give you so much more than on flagship phones, which you don't even get a charger in the box these days. Starting with the pros, I would say design and overall the way that a phone feels is good. I wouldn't say it's going to be the most luxurious thing in the world, but it definitely feels better than just an $80 phone, in the sense that even though it's not as glittery and shimmery as their previous attempts with the fancy gradient effect, now instead of using this plastic, I think they're actually using a thin layer of metal. Now it is very thin, and at first I thought it was actually plastic, but if you put your hand over it, the texture as well as the fact that it's cold to the touch makes me suspect it is a thin layer of aluminum. So that metal build is going to be a little bit more resistant to wear and tear. It doesn't show fingerprints as easily, and it makes the phone just feel a little more solid as you're gripping it. With that being said, the frame of the phone is still made out of plastic, so only the back here is metal. One unfortunate habit that XGoody has retained, though, is still using this camera cluster that makes the phone look like an expensive flagship from afar, but in reality, only the primary camera is a real lens, rated at 5 megapixels. The other two are just for decorative purposes. They at least are honest about that in their ads, but from a design perspective, I honestly would have preferred save the cost from the material into putting an extra gig of RAM. I think it would be even better. Anyways, on the spine of the phone, we do have access to a volume rocker. There is a power key, and on the very bottom here, that Type-C port for charging and data, along with a loudspeaker. With that being said, it doesn't really support quick charging, so to fully top up this 3000 milliamp hour capacity back from zero took me around 3 hours to fully juice up. But it is what it is. You can also use a power bank, of course, while you still operate the phone. Anyways, on the side here, we have the SIM ejector slot. It is a dual SIM phone, so you can pop in 2 cards, again, supporting 4G LTE, or the second one is also a hybrid slot that can dub as a micro SD card reader. And that's really the likely use scenario of that second slot, because the phone comes with just 16 gigs of built-in storage as default, which really isn't a lot, even though Android Go Edition is light. If you want to take some photos, install some applications, that's going to fill up quite fast. So thankfully, you do get that memory expansion, and the top here does house the 3.5mm headphone jack. So anyways, coming back to the phone itself, on the front we can see there is a 6-inch IPS display, which has a 18:9 or 2:1 aspect ratio. And it's not as flashy looking as having a hole punch display or even a teardrop notch that many of Xgoody's previous phones tried to do, which, yes, does make it look a little bit more modern and get you a better screen-to-body ratio, but like I said, this phone is all about them stripping some of those glitz and glamour, but giving you a more practical phone at the end of the day. And a full version of Android Go Edition, unlike on some of their other phones where they try to actually power it using a super outdated version of Android, something like Android 4.4, and just slap a launcher on top of it to make it look newer, and really didn't do any optimization from the software perspective. This at least really is a more up-to-date version of the OS. They're focusing more on what actually matters for a budget phone. So anyways, going back to this display, even though we do have a little bit larger of a chin at the top and bottom, I still think it looks quite good. There's no protrusions from the camera, which by the way is located at the very top. And what's also a little bit of a treat is there is a front-facing kind of selfie flash, so it can illuminate you when you're taking photos or videos in darker environments. It is IPS, so that means you are getting some decent viewing angles, unlike some TN panels that you often would see on other super low-cost phones from a lot of prepaid brands. So if you're tilting the screen, at least colors don't really wash out, and it's not really shifting blue or black or anything, even at extreme angles, which is good. However, this is a non-laminated panel, which means that there is still a little bit of a gap between the glass and the actual LCD underneath, which you can kind of tell if you're pointing at it from the light. So it could still be, of course, improved, but at the very least, colors look quite good, and even the brightness levels I think are acceptable for a budget phone. So even if you're using this where there is a little bit of sunlight around you, you should still be able to mostly make out what you are looking at. And full Google services are supported on here, so no issues in that department. Let's actually jump into the camera first. So cameras, I would say, has always been more of a weakness on budget phones, and really in this regard, there's not too much that the V40 can do to escape that. Comparing it with more expensive phones, it's an area where you'll see a much bigger gap, but you do have a few settings to play around with here, such as a self-timer, ISO, and there are a few preset scenes on here, but they don't make the most dramatic difference in the world, especially since video recording is capped at 720p or just HD resolution, so you kind of expect what you're getting here. It's no match for a more expensive device. So again, if you are really a photography buff, you definitely should look elsewhere, probably at some of the budget older generation Pixels, and as long as you don't have your expectations too high, at least you can still make out things like text, and every once in a while in terms of outdoor shots, if you have good enough lighting, things can still turn out all right, but again, it's not going to do you any wonders, but again, it's functional. Now, the front-facing camera, I would say, even though it's also 5 megapixels, tends to be not quite as colorful. So you tend to have to be in a pretty well-lit environment to get the best effect if you're doing selfies or video chats. But once again, it's functional and nothing too surprising for a budget phone, which is to say it is acceptable, but nothing extraordinary. Now, similarly, when it comes to making phone calls, it is a phone at the end of the day. I would say it's also passable. I tried it using T-Mobile here in the United States, and I was able to get a decent connection at the very least, and at least the microphone and the speaker, earpiece all sounded pretty loud and clean. So when it comes to just talking to folks, they really didn't have too much problems in terms of hearing me, and vice versa. Now, speaking of, if we are taking a look at some of that notification shade here, again, very stock, so you do have access to things like a dark mode. Out of the box, with that 16 gigabyte, you will get around 11 to 12 gigs free for you to install programs and apps. Not a ton, but if you're conservative, you can get by, or again, expanding the memory is probably going to be one of the things you'll want to do with that micro SD card slot. Otherwise, in terms of battery life, it's been okay, and it will get you through about a day, sometimes a day and a half if you're using it more on standby, in terms of watching some videos, making a few phone calls, which is, again, pretty average. It does support a form of face unlock, and as you've maybe noticed, there is no biometric fingerprint scanner on here, so you can't use that to unlock the phone, like a lot of other budget devices in this price range. So you have to use that front-facing cam to authenticate or use a password. Android 10, of course, does technically support gestures, but Android Go Edition, at least on this phone, seems to be restricting that. So for instance, if I am searching up gestures, even though it's in the source code, you don't get the option to change that yourself. Overall navigation on the system level also is alright, but that's this one area where, again, the 2 gigs of RAM coupled with the slightly aging MediaTek processor is just scraping by. It's kind of the theme of the entire phone. It's sufficient, but you just have to wait a split second longer for things to open and load. You're not going to get the most buttery smooth of animations, but again, for a budget device, that should kind of be expected, and it's alright. If we jump into YouTube, for instance, we can watch back some videos, and over here, let's also kind of hear what the speakers sound like. We'll crank that up a bit. Right, so overall takeaways being that I think the speaker can definitely be a little bit louder, but at the very least it doesn't sound too tinny, thankfully, so it is alright for just listening to some quick videos with. Or you can always use the 3.5mm headphone jack, always great to see. At the very least, again, that 6-inch display is large enough, has a modern enough aspect ratio that content feels comfortable, especially on a budget phone. You can pinch in to get a full screen view. But you can kind of tell there that it takes a split second sometimes for things to catch on. So generally speaking, it's going to be okay in terms of just watching back some quick videos with. Here's a quick web browsing test using The Verge as a benchmark. Again, reception quality using Wi-Fi also seems to be fair. I was, for the most part, always connected to a network. And loading up this page here, which is pretty complex, will definitely take a few moments longer than on a newer device with faster internals, but for what it is, it definitely still gets the job done. I mean, I can still scroll and things aren't really locking up on me, but you can tell how there's still a lot of elements here that will take definitely longer for them to fully render. If you are trying to bounce back and forth between a ton of open tabs or have a lot of other programs in the background, it would be generally advisable to close out of things that you're not using to get you the best performance. If you want to do a Google search or go into more advanced things like cards and news feeds, you actually have to tap on the search bar specifically to jump into the Google app first. So there's an extra step there which tries to, again, use up a little bit less data resources as well as help out the phone from refreshing itself using too many animations. So once we're in here, we're able to find our Discover tab, basically our news feed of articles that we're interested in, and also refresh details as we would like. Overall, again, it will allow you to also access some web apps, which are essentially just links to the browser, and you don't have to necessarily download the official native app from the Play Store. And this will allow you to take up less memory and space because you're using just the web version of it, and built-in storage is limited. The phone does have built-in GPS, so you can use it for turn-by-turn navigation, although it emits a NFC chip, which is, again, pretty expected for a budget phone. When it comes to gameplay, I would say it's also an area of relative weakness on budget phones in general, and this is really no exception. I mean, the very simplest of games with more kind of 2D style animations will work just fine. Titles like Angry Birds, really light games that we're talking about now, it can still handle. With that being said, anything more demanding, and you're going to notice a lot more dropped frames, it's just not going to be the most pleasant experience on the limited hardware that's present. So again, if you are expecting more powerful performance, you'll often have to definitely spend a little bit more for just a more powerful phone at the end of the day. But again, games like Stack here certainly do function. It does get a little bit warmer, primarily on the top right-hand section of the phone. It gets a little bit more toasty, but I would say I haven't really seen any hints of thermal throttling or anything crazy like that to speak of, but it's not going to be quite as cool to the touch if you're using it for basic tasks. So that's more or less it as far as our quick hands-on review of the Xgoody V40. Like I said, for this company, which is all about the super low-cost budget phones, it's actually, I think, a step in the right direction. Instead of spending the extra cost on making the phone look more flashy than it really needs to be, ended up cutting more corners. Things like using a TN panel or only putting 3G or even 2G in some cases on their older products. So now we finally have fixed some of those issues along with using actually a metal build, but as long as you're not expecting anything wild, it will still be serviceable. Things like making phone calls, watching some quick videos, and generally quick browsing the web, it can handle that without really any issues, and for the most part, I would say it definitely is looking still and feeling for the most part a bit better than you would expect for a super budget phone. You can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below. For now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews.